Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. We are back with another conversation around this brilliant book that has been edited by Senator Sherry Rehman, President Jinnah Institute, a former diplomat as well as a federal minister. And the book is called Womansplaining, and Womansplaining is edited by Sherry with 22 insightful essays by the leaders and pioneers of the women's movement in Pakistan, as well as new entrants into the struggle. And this compendium, I congratulate Sherry again for bringing together all these voices. And today with Sherry, we also have two of our most important women leaders Pakistan has produced, pioneers of this journey, of this struggle. Muhtarma Zohra Yusuf. Muhtarma Zohra Yusuf has been a journalist and a human rights defender all her life. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to Zora Appa today. She's been the twice former chair of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. She's been associated with the International Federation of Human Rights, South Asians for Human Rights, and many, many more national, regional, and international human rights initiatives that have been taken. And she also writes, and we are very privileged also to have another important politician, a leader. I don't like to qualify by calling everybody a woman's leader or a woman leader. I think you're leaders of our society, and you have enriched us in so many ways that people still have to understand that how long this journey has been and how many gains we have made because of people like Shahnaz Wazir Ali. And Shahnaz is currently the president of Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Institute of Science and Technology. It's a university, and she has worked as a federal education minister. She has worked as special assistant to Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. She's been instrumental in bringing about changes into our policy and legislation when it comes to public health and women's health care. Thank you very much, Shahnaz. Thank you very much, Zora and Sherry, for joining me today. And we are going to speak about three essays in the book. And one is by Zora Yusuf. And I'll start this conversation by asking Zora Appa about the evolution, because you have sort of looked at the movement from the days of Apwa Begums, as you call them, and not just you call them. I mean, that's how they are referred to. But they had a lot of initial struggle that they waged against the marriage laws, and then the Aili Qawaneen during Ayub Khan came about. And then the next landmark for you is WAF in the 1980s, Women's Action Forum, of which you were a key a leader. And then the third is Aurat March, which is recent, which is today, which is contemporary. So how do you look at this evolution, and what, because it's a personal journey for you, but it will enlighten our listeners and viewers. If you also tell us a little bit about how do you see it going into the future in terms of gaining more access and gaining more visibility for women.
Well, there's one aspect of the women's movement that I think we need to look at and discuss. And that is, apart from the Aurat March, Apwa and even the Women's Action Forum, more so in the early years, they wanted to de-link themselves from politics. And, they went to great extents to claim that they were apolitical. And I think that was a mistake. And that is perhaps, one of the reasons why, Appa, of course, turned to charity work after the family laws were passed, etc. And that was its key focus. But Women's Action Forum, I think, made a mistake in the early years by declaring itself to be apolitical, because I believe that every women's movement has to be rooted in politics, and we should not fall for the establishment's efforts to paint politicians in a bad light, to defame politics, because without politics, good, bad, ugly, and without democracy, the women's movement cannot take root. So I did, yes. I think Women's Action Forum is now getting more engaged in issues that matter. I mean, apart from just women's issues and broader issues. So that's a good development. And when it comes to the Aurat March, I hope it's not a flash in the pan, because these young women, with their courage, they give you hope, but at the same time, they have to recognize the political aspects, the fact that it must have grounding in politics. And that doesn't necessarily mean aligning themselves with, I mean, in the long run, they have to take the support of political parties, because that's all we have. And what we're seeing today, unfortunately, is really the destruction of institutions. So even if women want a democratic movement, who do they turn to? The parliament is being made ineffective. We have an ordnance factory in the president's house. So where do women turn to? And if you look at the legislation, the pro-women legislation that we have seen in some governments, and more in civilian governments than military, they have all been initiated by women legislators. And what is also remarkable is that when pro-women legislation has come forward, we have seen support across the parties. There has been little opposition, at least from women members. So I think that is something encouraging. But I just like to reiterate that the women's movement has to be grounded in democracy. It has to be grounded in the political realities that we have.
Thank you very much, and that brings me to Shahnaz, who's been a politician and who's also been a civil rights activist as well as a social worker, I would say. And Shahnaz, I mean, if you can build the conversation from where Zora has left it, and you can pick it up from there. In terms of public health, I mean, we were having an off-camera discussion just before we started this program, and you wanted to speak about this nexus between women's rights and democracy. And I was challenging in terms of, you know, uh, there's some background noise, I believe, somewhere. So I was actually sort of trying to challenge you by saying that the family laws as well as the Women's Protection Acts, they were all a product of martial rules. I mean, during the martial rules or the assemblies under the martial rulers, they were passed, and you were vociferously challenged, against it. And you were saying that without democracy, women's rights or any rights for that matter cannot be realized. So I would like you to start with that, and then of course come to your experience, your personal experience, political as well as outside, and then we'll come to health later.
Thank you very much, Harris, and I'd like to take this opportunity really to thank Sherry for this absolutely remarkable anthology compendium, a sequential narration of how the women's rights movement has developed, how the advocacy, the agency, and how the coalescing has taken place. And as I read the other chapters from the younger women's rights activists, it is really remarkable, and it set me thinking a great deal about the early days, and which is what you're referring to in a sense, and Zora has also talked about that. Yes, let's take the question of democracy. Do democratic governments give more space? Definitely, I would say unequivocally yes. The terrain is hard to negotiate. It's not easy. It's not just a plain landing strip that suddenly you get women arrive in parliaments in larger numbers, and therefore there is more substantive legislation. I felt very clearly that one of the first battles I had to fight was within parliament. Even though it was a democratic parliament, constitutionally elected representatives, both national and provincial governments and the Senate. But the parliament represents all shades of opinion. And there were a lot of conservatives, and some of our bills actually would get stuck on this hard rock of the orthodox religious conservative parties who made sure that they would sabotage and ensure that the legislation and the laws didn't see the light of day. However, that critical mass of women, I'm specifically referring now to the multiple, I would say, interregnums of real democratic government, because we've had so many interruptions and interventions, that critical mass actually did finally succeed, but not in all cases, because there has been opposition. There are some bills that were delayed, that were postponed, because politics, obviously, on the parliamentary, on the floor of the assemblies, is often a negotiation and a compromise on certain things. But Harris, I've heard you speak about this before, that during times of dictatorship, there's been the family laws ordinance. That was 60 years ago almost. And subsequently, so much else has happened. It's one singular little thing that came about during Ayub Khan's regime, but subsequently, so much else has happened. And also during Musharraf's regime, yes, he increased the number of seats in parliament. But I think that alone does not mean that that gave a lot of space. Look at it's not sustainable. Have we got all those women councillors now in local government? No. All these issues are political. Those military regimes thrust their agenda. Why don't you talk about the military regime of Ziaul Haq? What did it do? Did it give space to women? Not at all. So I think there is a need for discussing. this मेरा ख्याल में हमें ये बिल्कुल बड़ी संजीदगी से सोचना चाहिए कि कौन से दौरों में ख़वातीन मुतहर्रिक हो सकी थी within the parliament and outside the parliament. The other point I think Zora made, which I feel that we often do discuss, and my colleagues and myself, who all of us were part of those absolutely heady, momentous days in the early 80s when we all gathered together under the banner of WAF. And I do always want to recognize that with us, shoulder to shoulder, were the lawyers, were the students, and were the labor unions, and the journalists. So I think that while we spearheaded it, and icons and real freedom and democratic leaders, Asma Jahangir, Shelly Zia, there are names really that are absolutely, without them, I think we would not have been able to achieve what we did. But the central argument of should WAF have gone political or recognized itself as political, I do think we should have. And as Zora might remember, and I'm sure Sherry would too, there were very, very intense arguments in WAF at that time. Are we going to be political? And there was a body of opinion amongst us WAPers that used to say, no, we are not going to be political. Now that was really, I think it was a disconnect in a sense. What we really meant was, yes, we are political because rights is political. हकूक जो है, जब आप हकूक की बात करते हैं, आप अपने आईनी हकूक की बात करते हैं, आप अपने माशरे में अपनी जगह की बात करते हैं, तो ये सारे सवाल जो हैं, ये सियासी सवाल हैं, लेकिन we were non-partisan. So we began to define ourselves at that time. Yes, WAF is it addresses political issues, freedom, agency, voice, representation, rights, all these are political issues, but we were non-partisan. So now coming very quickly to the development nexus. It took a long time in Pakistan for the rights agenda to be articulated and become centerpiece of the development agenda. And actually, in many ways, this discussion came to us from the international arenas, from the United Nations. When the Millennium Development Goals, and prior to that, the Sustainable Development Goals were articulated, I think this was a rather belated response of the international community realizing that they had not done enough for development, and they situated it in the context of the rights. So there's the right to education, the right to livelihoods, the right to safety, the right to jobs, to employment, to good housing, to infrastructure and health, and many others. And therefore, how does the development, for example, sector in health today reflect the rights agenda? What are the rights of women in health? And the Lady Health Workers Program is a response to that concept. And Benazir Bhutto actually realized it very early on. And she began to talk about the need for us to do something about responding to the needs of women, because it was their right for the state to provide them health care. And that's where the Lady Health Workers Program originated. The idea was there before she became Prime Minister. And when she became Prime Minister, we moved rapidly on it. So what does the Lady Health Workers Program really do for women? Because often the women's movement doesn't really talk much about the LHWs, because it's seen more as a service provider. But clearly it is embedded, and it draws its strength from the very idea and concept that every woman, every child has a right to be provided primary and promotive health care at their doorstep. यही वो लेडी हेल्थ वर्कर करती है ना, वो उसको ट्रेनिंग दी जाती है, वो दहलीज पर पहुंचती है. I can't hear you, Harris.
Please carry on.
So I think maybe I'm carrying on too long, and I would.
No, I was just asking, just for the benefit of viewers, that which particular year are we talking about? It was
1994.
Yeah. Okay.
The Lady Health Workers was formally presented through the normal bureaucratic multiple processes that we all have to follow. Finally, the papers landed on the cabinet table, and everybody supported it. The idea was explained, and I must give credit to Dr. Kesar Bengali, because he was the key person who worked on concepts of social rights and throughout, and he also contributed to that. And he subsequently contributed much more to the Benazir Income Support Program. But what I'm saying is that social scientists, social economists did contribute to it. However, it was largely, I would say, it was the concept, the idea, and the commitment was Muhtarma Benazir Bhutto. I translated it, and simultaneously with that, she said, which is something I had also proposed to her, you can't just do health alone, you've got to do health and education together. So what did we do in the first term? We made sure
I'll come to you later. I'll come to you later on education. I'm sorry, Shahnaz. I'm going to come back to you after, because you have mentioned Muhtarma Benazir Bhutto, and this book is dedicated to her memory. And there's something that Sherry always says is that her understanding of why it is important for women to be in politics and to be in power actually comes from Benazir Bhutto. So I would like to move on to Sherry now, and Sherry is the editor of this book, of course, but she has also done one essay on women about women in parliament and women in power, and the insider challenges. So Sherry, first, please, if you can explain that, why do you say that? I mean, how did Muhtarma Benazir Bhutto made you understand the importance of women in politics? Because it is actually, I mean, in Pakistan, if you look at both our main icons of democratic struggle are both women, Fatima Jinnah and Benazir Bhutto. So I can understand, but still, for the benefit of all of us, if you can explain that a little further. And then, of course, what was the motivation for bringing together all these voices and coming out with this compendium?
Thank you, Harris. And first of all, I'd also like to thank you for doing this for us, and also to Shahnaz, Wazir Ali, and Zora, Yusuf. Both have been comrades in arms in different parts of my life, and without literally your lifeblood to this struggle and your commitment to it, we would not be sitting here. We would not be discussing these freedoms the way we are, because they were certainly not frontlined the way we expect them, with the way we want them. But one of the reasons I've done this book is because I think the huge youth cohort, 65 to 70% of Pakistan's population is under 30, 35, and they have very little understanding of how we have come to where we are, the goalposts we had to cross, the reversals, the heartbreaking reversals we regularly face, and how important it is to push for what you believe in, and how important it is to reach out to others. And then that, of course, brings me back to the squares the circle with politics. I mean, internationally, there is a trend towards the uh, dirtification of politics, I call it, that it is a grimy, sleazy pole that you have to keep climbing. Very little is discussed about what politics can and should achieve. But really, some of us are in it only for that. I don't mean to self valorize. There's a lot more to politics than achieving goals, but without those goals, it loses its lifeblood. And Motarma Benazir Bhutto Shaheed, literally, I had an aversion to, I couldn't imagine myself, Zora, as you know, as a politician. I could not even, I was comfortable writing, I was a journalist. It still gives me a rush that nothing else does, the writing, that is another reason to do the book. But after 10 years of being editor Herald, I kept wondering, and it's a question we asked ourselves, as to how do we move the needle further to changing public positions, to moving because we saw the transition from the Zia years to the very, very horrifying, chillingly repressive Zia years, to a very tumultuous decade of democracy, which really wasn't governments holding power, just office in many ways. But still, they were able to achieve goals that they had set their hearts to, like the lady health workers is the backbone of Pakistan's primary healthcare system. People don't realize that. That is the principal backbone to this day, after the whittling, after the reductions. And it's also that they also become the polio vaccinators very often in perilous conditions. So women from top to bottom are at the front line of public service. And what Bibi really said to me was, she said, you want to make a difference, why are you reluctant? You love speaking out. Yes, you have a voice. This will amplify the voice. You need to be out there and amplify your voice. And I said, but we are used to telling truth to power. And there's very little, often we don't even use filters. And she was like, that's okay. The People's Party has a high tolerance for that. Certainly she did. And they continue to this day. We run very rambunctious Central Executive Committee meetings where everybody speaks their mind. But what I'm saying today is that, look, I'm concerned about the many, and Zora addressed this and Shahnaz in a different way, that, the politics is the personal. We know that. The political battles are also to be fought at home. If you are going to have autonomy over which today's women seek, very rightly so, over your choices, your bodies, your income, then those decisions have to be fought for at home. You then ask yourself, why hasn't the domestic violence bill been passed? Heinous crimes are being, femicide is rampant. Delhi is the rape capital of South Asia. Why? Why? Because these things, movements or activism, have to be rooted in politics, as Zora says. And without the connection to politics, if there is a gap, then all this becomes, all of the wonderful things that the younger women are doing lands itself in a vacuum or a stalemate. And very often they become victims of a horrendous backlash, which exists all over the growing extremism in society. I actually have an interesting WhatsApp group of the younger women who reached out after the Aurat March for obviously guidance and protection. And of course, we are right there for them, and we will always be. And that group is called Backlash. So they actually, and to this day, it's called Backlash. It's so funny, because that is when every year when they feel the space shrinking, when they feel the predatory impulse of the reactionary parties and others, the online predations they face, and also then they feel that, they have to actually engage with the states, they have to engage with mainstream political parties, and they have to sort of walk away from the shall we say, reaction to politics, the mainstream politics. So, I realized long ago that it is, even if you have NGOs, civil society is critical to defining the ideal and to pushing for it. It's critical. So is the media. It navigates many kind of resistances and obviously the pushbacks. But politics, of course, with its very vast jugular, is able to do things which no other, I feel, system can. I mean, political parties bring critical mass right away. They're able to get their message right away, and they can become one of the most important and, shall I say, force multipliers for change. So we have to use political parties and the system to speak to rights issues, and I think we try our best. There are again many reversals and compromise. The scary thing about politics is you have to muddy your fingers, and very often you have to step back when you don't want to, and you are vilified for that. But you have to carry then the numbers that you need the next day after a so-called tactical retreat. So strategic decisions have to be made always. And the point women face in parliament is that for years they were used as shock troops by political parties. They still are, even in parliament. चले बाहर आके protest करें, चले सामने शोर मचाएं, मगर अब औरतें बाशऊर भी होती जा रही हैं, काम भी बड़ा करती हैं जी पार्लियामेंट में, जिन कभी कभी ऐसे माहौल से आती हैं जहां उनका एक्सपोजर नहीं होता, लेकिन जो होमवर्क करके आती हैं, जितने पार्लियामेंट्री जिसे कहते हैं ना बिजनेस रेजोल्यूशंस, क्वेश्चन, सवाल सारे, मतलब एक जमाने में तो कोई 60-70% औरतों का ही था और वो 20% थी पार्लियामेंट में. तो देखिए,
I'll come back to you. I have to, because Zora Appa has been very patiently listening to all of us.
Yes.
But, I would like to confirm, I did a study between, and we dedicated it to the memory of Fawzia Wahab. It looked at the parliamentary, जो आपका होता है ना, उसको क्या कहलाता है वो, पार्लिमानी कार्रवाई जो होती है, between 2008 and 2018. And it was amazing what you're saying. 70% of parliamentary proceedings, 70%, and और वो जो private member bills होते हैं और जो conversations होती हैं, 70% was done by 22% women in the National Assembly. When I'm speaking about the National Assembly, 22%, 21% women and 70% of parliamentary work. So absolutely, this is there. But since you've spoken about movements, and you have also spoken about media and civil society. So my question to you, Zora Appa, is that, and let me explain. I mean, if I don't know if I'm clear, that how can a discussion take place between, because you conclude by saying that there is a need for a discussion and debate between the older generation and the newer generation of activists, but it's a wider argument, and you have explained it. But I find it very difficult that if you have movements who have no ideological nucleus, for want of a better word, or there's no ideological moorings, and then you have movements who are ideologically motivated, then how can that debate take place? And when I say I use the word ideology liberally, I mean, but there has to be some theory behind a movement and some grounding, as we are all discussing. But if you don't find those roots, and also, and another supplementary question is, because I'm thinking, it's between the labor, the media, the journalists, and women. So we see all these movements working in silos. I mean, there's very little collaboration between the labor movement, the women's movement, and the students' movement, and the teachers' movement, for instance. Different identity and rights movements are working separately from each other. So how can they all be brought together?
Oh, that's a tall order, Horace. I don't know how to answer it fully. But, as far as Women's Action Forum is concerned, I've always seen it as an ideological movement. I may have some, sort of disagreements perhaps on the fact that they were very vocal about being apolitical, etc., but it's certainly an ideological movement. As far as Aurat March is concerned, they are very passionate. They're talking about the right issues, certainly, issues that matter. but I think they still need to find their bearings. Perhaps it's not fair to put this burden on them. And yes, there certainly needs to be an interaction between perhaps, Women's Action Forum, the Aurat March more closely, but without, I would say, without stifling them. I don't think the spirit of the Aurat March should be diluted. If they're meeting, let's say, older members or consulting older members of Women's Action Forum, I think perhaps the passion that they bring, combined with the ideology that WAF represents, could be a good sort of mix. And you talked about, you know, civil society movements not interacting with others. But I remember, and I think Shahnaz she also referred to it, when we were marching on the streets of Karachi during the time of Ziaul Haq, when it was really, violating a martial law regulation. We had lawyers with us, we had journalists with us, we had fisherwomen with us, and the labor, etc. So it wasn't just women marching, but we had, let's say, a broader segment of rights activists. But perhaps what is not happening is that when journalists protest, we don't see, let's say, a contingent from WAF joining them. So it's been, let's say, the other way around. Women have been supported, but we haven't been, let's say, active enough in supporting the rights of others. Perhaps we have in our hearts we do, but we have not demonstrated it sufficiently. I would admit to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Shahnaz, I'm sorry I interrupted you, cut you in the middle when you were speaking about, you had just started speaking about education and other social rights besides health. So one is that, I mean, what would you like to add there? And also, you see, I would also like you to comment on the current situation. I mean, we have spoken about history and we have spoken, but we see that lady health workers, teachers, sanitation workers, clerks, nobody is being paid for months unending in current times. Then polio workers are being attacked, killed randomly across different regions in Pakistan. I mean, where do you see it going as a politician as well as a women's rights activist and somebody who has been so close to bringing about these progressive changes? They're all threatened, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely, Harris. You've seen headlines of polio workers being shot, being attacked. Women in workplaces are not safe. The polio worker is, of course, the most prominent example of that type of violence perpetrated on them. And so the question arises, why? Why do the polio workers get attacked? And that's not just a gender question. That is really related to the very strong and violent, I would say, displayed in violence, the views of certain communities which are against the state doing anything to the health of their women or their children. This is, again, a very interesting patriarchal reflection of how male responses occur. Who shoots a polio worker? Usually a man or a group of men, old or young, and they invariably seem to espouse the cause of traditionalism, of conservatism, of what I would call retrogressive thinking in society. So I think it's a very complicated matter. A polio worker is not shot because she's creating a noise and a pandemonium in the street. She's shot because she's entering the household. The household is supposed to be a place of sanctity by certain sections of our society. And furthermore, this commodification of women is a very closely connected concept with why a polio worker gets shot at. And by that I mean that the male members of the household, and as you know, in many of these families, they are joint family systems. This is not the nuclear family. outside which a polio worker gets shot, or any other worker. And I'll expand this discussion a little bit by saying reproductive family planning workers have also had to face a lot of violence. When they go in and talk about family planning, reproductive rights, access to contraception, tell women that you can actually take the implant, take a certain shot, have multiple ways of doing reproductive contraception. So they are also often pushed out. They're barred from coming into the household because the woman is seen as the commodity owned by the man, and she is seen as a vehicle for reproductive functions. And they do not want anybody coming in and doing anything to the body of the woman. Here I'm talking very physically about the biological systems of a woman. They don't want shots to be given to children because they think as they grow up, it's a matter of infertility. This is going to cause infertility. When reproductive health workers go in there, they feel that the woman's agency for reproduction is going to be restricted. So I think there are very complex social interactions and responses at play here. Talking about safety at work, it is certainly polio workers are often very threatened because they're out there in the open. But there's a lot of questions about safety at workplaces. And of course, as you know, during the 2008 to 2013 parliamentary term, which the People's Party led the government, we came up with the anti-sexual harassment bill and safety of women at workplaces, amongst many others. Protection of women from various other forms of discrimination, harassment, and disenfranchisement of their right to property and so forth. So workplace safety is a very big issue. And I think that can be altogether a different discussion, but it's also about rights. Pay and protection, benefits, all of these are ultimately, they may be economic issues, they're functions of the state, but everything really connects with what we call an egalitarian system.
Absolutely.
A fair and free, justiciable, egalitarian system. And so therefore, as I mentioned earlier, Harris, I think this discussion about what we typically see as the development agenda and put it in a silo, that, schools are development, water is development, sanitation, health, and all of that, and rights is another issue. It's not like that.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're all very closely connected.
Well, thank you very much, Shahnaz. We are pressured with time, so I'm going to, finally, I'll come to Sherry and ask her about the, if we what we have discussed right now, and from the 80s onward, I mean, this society is being radicalized more and more day by day. And so we all understand the importance of progressive legislation, progressive policy making, but if there's no reception and there's no acknowledgement in society at large, and there's no acceptance of this progressive legislation that we have done over the past couple of decades, I would say, then how do we move forward? I mean, what can be done? What can we do to actually de-radicalize, as it were, de-radicalize the mindsets around us? What can the politicians do? What can the parliament do?
Question. The politicians, if I may, a few of us spend our time mostly holding back the tide of extremist reaction coming our way. That is where most of our energies and political capital is spent very often in parliament, and most of it is behind the scenes. It's in committee rooms, it's in undocumented meetings. But what often happens is, for instance, I find myself standing there saying, why is Malala Yousafzai being vilified? Or what is it that you find difficult to accept about women working outside the home? What is it that you find difficult to accept about women educating themselves, the girl children? I mean, because if you remember in the 2009-10 era, when the advance of many extremisms and violent extremism was upon us from Swat to the rest of Pakistan, and the operations, the kinetic operations were launched against them, the hearts and minds issue was had still to be carried on. It's a question of culture and society also, how we speak to it, how we relate to it. The politics is an important layer of it. But if you remember, girls' schools immediately would be in the crosshairs of Taliban and TTP bombings. It was a time where we couldn't open schools in KP. I remember calling the CM KP and saying, when are you? He said it's very tough, Sherry. It was ANP was in power then, and so it's not like even the progressive governments have had to face a terrible backlash constantly, and it's almost like we're fighting to just hold on to what we have, and that becomes the the one step backward, or rather the two steps backwards we were speaking about. So this is a constant. It's a constant trope in legislation. Oh, let's send a bill out of parliament to supra-parliamentary bodies, which is very often becomes a legislative graveyard for them. Or let's just take it down because it's against religion. Very often it's not, and you have to then. Religion is weaponized against women. Extremism is weaponized against women. It is done not just in Parliament. Parliament is still a safer space. It is still less extreme, and people tend towards a certain middle of the road response to be able to carry others. But outside Parliament, it's in the television soap boxes. You will see unchecked embrace of extremism and an unchecked embrace of misogyny. So we really have to speak out at the risk of our lives. We still have to keep speaking out at times that are where we feel that we will. For instance, I'm not going to say, Harris, Zora, put yourself in the line of fire. Because as I said to a friend very recently, just 2 days ago, I said, please stay alive so you live to fight another day. These are the conversations we are having. I said, keep quiet now. We will need you to fight another day. This is where we are today. And this is why mobilizations and convenings, I consider the book a convening of such sorts, are important. We need critical mass and we need political connections. Without that, we're all scattered people with megaphones that go home then, right?
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thank you very much. I think you summed it up very well. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the book Womansplaining, and it is available in all major bookstores across Pakistan and can be ordered online from Polio Books, Lahore. And it is a joint production of Polio Books. Polio Books is the publisher, and they have worked very closely with Jinnah Institute, with Sherry chairs, to produce this work. And I thank you all, Shahnaz Wazir Ali Sahiba, Muhtarma Zora Yusuf, Senator Sherry Rehman. Thank you all very much for joining me to discuss some essays which are contained in this book. There are 22 in all, and I hope that there will be more conversations around different entries in future. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Harris. Nice to be here. Okay.